associate professor of Slavic languages. I teach Ukrainian, so if any of you would be interested in studying the language, you are more than welcome. I work at the Department of Languages and Literatures, which is the biggest department of the Faculty of Humanities. We offer many different languages, and in the area of Slavic languages, we are currently offering Slavic medieval studies, headed by my colleague, Professor Antonetta Granberg, and also Russian and Ukrainian. And today it's a great honor for me to welcome someone that I met very early on in my career. We actually met back in 1998 when I had just defended my thesis, and I went to one of my first international conferences in Aarhus in Denmark. It was a conference on Galicia. And there I met Professor Pavlo-Роберт Маґочій. And I'm so very happy that you agreed to come here and talk to us today. And your career is long and distinguished, so long in fact that I have to have a piece of paper here to read from. Professor Maγκocsi completed his education at Rutgers University and at Princeton, where he got his PhD in 1972. He has then taught at Harvard, at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, at Prešov University in Slovakia, and he's also been no less than 5 times historian in residence at the Max Planck Institute for Social Anthropology in Halle in Germany. He's a permanent fellow of the Royal Canadian Society, and he holds 2 honorary degrees. He is a Doctor Honoris Causa from the University of Prešov in Slovakia, and he is a Počestný professor at the university, an honorary professor at the University of Kam'янець-Podilský in Ukraine. He has written a lot on nationalism, in particularly among ethnic groups living in border areas. But he's also published in history, sociolinguistics, etc. And I first came across Professor Maγκocsi by studying this fantastic book, A History of Ukraine, which you published in 1996. And do you mind if I pass it around?
No, absolutely not, except unfortunately it's the old edition completely.
Yeah, it is. I bought the old one.
In 2010.
Yeah.
But please.
Yeah, please. Okay. So, and the structure of today's lecture is that Professor Maγκocsi has agreed to have a short introduction of about perhaps 20 minutes or something, yeah. Mm-hmm. And then we'll have a small conversation and we'll allow questions from the audience and have a discussion. So, Professor, please.
Thank you very much, colleague, Professor, and now I see the correct pronunciation is Rosen.
Yes, it is. Yes, thank you.
I'm trying to learn Swedish. First, I would say I'm very sorry that I cannot address you in Swedish, but we all have handicaps, and this is one of my many. I get the picture that we are here in a center for languages and literatures, modern languages and literatures. I have done some work in the field of sociolinguistics, including language codification, including codification of one of the newest East Slavic languages. But so I can understand some of you if that's the fields that you're in, or at least your disciplines. But I'm going to be speaking today in some ways out of character as a historian by profession. Historians should not play games like political scientists do and be a kind of prophets of the present and future. But after all, we're all human beings and we live in the present. Maybe some of us are still going to be living in the future. And we all know that before us are great problems in Ukraine. the amount of commentary about Ukraine in the last 10 years is just overwhelming. And so why do we need another statement about contemporary Ukraine just because it's coming from me? Perhaps my take on these matters, despite numerous and tens of thousands of commentaries, may be slightly different. You'll see, and you'll comment on that, I guess. So that's what I would want to share with you as an opening statement for a further discussion. I believe we've just heard from Professor Rosen that the title has to do with Ukraine winning what I'm referring to as the Great Southern War. Now, it's unlikely that anyone has heard of the Great Southern War, but they may know of its obverse, the Great Northern War. And I don't have to, in this particular audience, explain what the Great Northern War was, since all of your forebears were quite engaged in it at some point. And we also know that during that Great Northern War, at the outset of the 18th century, that the turning point played itself out where? In the very heart of Ukraine, at Poltava in 1709, which by historians who look at the larger picture often consider this to be one of the most influential battles in history. Why? Amongst other things, within a decade of Muscovy's victory at Poltava, Sweden ceded the Baltic region to Muscovy, and then Muscovy transformed itself soon after into the Russian Empire. There was no such Russia before then. And today we're witnessing what may be called the Great Southern War, in which Russia has been seeking to regain control of Ukraine and its Black Sea coastal region. And since Russia's unprovoked invasions in 2014 and 2022, Ukraine is once again the center of an epical struggle that has drawn into the conflict not only the rest of Europe, but also directly or indirectly the world's present-day great powers and their client states. We all know of this disastrous cost in human lives and in material destruction, still being endured by millions of Ukrainians, which is matched by an even greater threat, the further expansion of Russia westward toward the European Union, and a possible armed conflict between today's great powers and their allies. But this Russian threat has been blunted, and it's thanks to Ukraine and Ukrainians. In a real sense, Ukraine is winning this current Great Southern War. Why, one might ask, how could they be winning? Well, first of all, the country has survived. Its government is intact. Its people remain committed to defending their homeland. And its military has been transformed into one of the most experienced fighting forces in the world. And so we might ask, what must be done to end this enormously destructive war and to bring about a just and lasting peace? We hear this term all the time. actually, the answers to those questions may not be so difficult or elusive as many of us think, but that's provided we keep two principles in mind. Two principles. Principle one, Ukraine was, is, and will remain in a permanent state of war. Principle two, Ukraine and its leaders cannot trust any great power. So let's look at these two principles. Principle one, Ukraine is a land like Israel. Both are located on real estate that has always been coveted by neighboring peoples and states who have been willing to wage war, in this case to control and keep Ukraine. Russia, whether in the form of the Tsarist Empire, the Soviet Union, or today's Russian Federation, has always considered Ukraine to be no more than a region, and moreover a region that is an integral part of the historic patrimony of Russia. That, what we may call an axiomatic belief is not only a matter of Russian state policy. It is deeply embedded in the minds of the Russian people. The Russian people at home, and even Russian emigres living abroad. As for Russia's homegrown opposition activists who at great personal risk protest the policies of Putin's authoritarian government, their liberal views, which everyone in the West like to praise, those liberal views do have limits. And certainly limits when it comes to Ukraine. In response to one very sensitive question, virtually all of Russia's opposition leaders respond, but of course, Crimea has forever been and forever must remain a Russian land, and therefore part of Russia. That not only Crimea, but all of Ukraine is part of Russia, that Ukrainians and Russians are of the same ancestral origin, and therefore are one people. Of course, these are not realities, but they are age-old stereotypical beliefs which are natural components of Russian cultural and religious values formed over centuries. And so why should it be surprising that Russia, contemporary Russia, and Russians have been, are, and remain willing to fight for what they consider their own Ukrainian family? Now, as difficult, if not impossible, for the Russian people and their leaders to accept is the reality that Ukrainians are a distinct people with their own language and a tradition of statehood that goes back at least to the mid-17th century. That's the subject of this little booklet here, Ukraine Redux, which means that the idea of Ukrainian statehood and actual Ukrainian statehood is well before the outbreak of that great Northern War that we spoke about. In short, Ukrainian cultural and religious values are decidedly different from Russian values, and those differences have only been intensified since the first phase of the present war that began in 2014. In fact, for over 300 years, Ukraine has been in the center of conflict in Eastern Europe. From Tsar Peter I's early 18th century Great Northern War, to Stalin's genocidal 20th century war against Ukraine's peasantry and its national intelligentsia, to Putin's ongoing 21st century Great Southern War. The present search for that just and lasting peace in this age-old contested territory of Ukraine is an exercise in futility. An exercise in futility. War, not peace, has been and will remain the norm. While permanent war is a reality, it may take different forms. Deadly military battles on land and in the air, a Cold War, a hybrid war, clandestine guerrilla war. Only in the best of circumstances will this permanent state of war be interrupted by periods of truce between Russia and Ukraine. Therefore, obtaining a truce, not some illusory peace, is the best outcome that all interested parties can hope for. Principle 2. Ukraine and its leaders should not trust any great powers. And that includes the United States. Now, it's not that Americans are inherently bad. It is the fact that the United States is a great power. And that means that it acts as all the world's great powers have traditionally acted. Whether, for example, France and Britain in the 19th and early 20th centuries, the United States, Soviet Union / Russia, and China in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Great powers have always acted in their own self-interest, which means that each one must reach an accommodation with fellow great powers. Put another way, today, only the United States, Russia, and China matter. The rest of the world is composed of minor and therefore dismissible countries. From Canada to Mexico, Brazil to Britain, Ukraine to Saudi Arabia, India to Japan, and everywhere else in between. And among these middling secondary powers is Europe, whether in the form of the EU or NATO. Only when and if Europeans prove themselves capable of acting in unity, only then can Europe hope to be taken seriously as a great power. Now, whether one wishes to speak of trust or self-interest, the fact remains that the great powers have always looked down on Central and Eastern Europe. Let's admit it. And probably Sweden is into that mix. For example, in 1938, in the wake of the Munich Pact, the Prime Minister of Britain, you all know his name, I won't even mention him with his little umbrella getting off the plane, pleased himself for attaining, quote-unquote, peace in our time, whereby he justified his appeasement of Hitler by successfully not letting Britain get involved quote unquote, in a quarrel in a faraway country, the former Czechoslovakia, between people of which we know nothing. In 1956, after encouraging the Hungarians to rebel against communist rule, the United States turned a blind eye when Soviet troops invaded Hungary to crush its revolution. In 1994, the United States, the United Kingdom, and Russia formulated the Budapest Memorandum, which ostensibly guaranteed the sovereignty and borders of Ukraine in return for surrendering its nuclear arsenal. These are just a few of many examples that could be given to illustrate what is often characterized as perfidy and betrayal, but what is nothing other than normal practice. Great powers acting in their self-interest. And so what should Ukraine do in the present circumstances of a brutal war that has reached a stalemate? Ever-changing events are sure to produce outcomes that no one can foresee, but, we're humans, so we have to speculate. We don't have to, but automatically we do. Now, if we accept the reality of Ukraine in a permanent state of war, principle 1, and the need to dismiss any great power as a reliable ally, principle 2, the following scenario, or some variant thereof, suggests a possible outcome for policymakers to reflect upon. Now, for those hoping for peace, there is likely to be at least a truce, perhaps to be brokered by the ultimate deal maker, Donald Trump. That truce may look something like the following. Russia will agree to a ceasefire and stop the hot war in return for the United States easing its sanctions and also blocking any idea of extending NATO membership to Ukraine. As part of this scenario, Russia will not give up its territorial gains in eastern and southern Ukraine, and certainly not Crimea. The United States might even guarantee the provisions of such a truce and in return gain control of some of Ukraine's mineral wealth. Now, some of you are already sitting in this room, I'm sure, and others would consider such a deal, or a truce deal, to be a catastrophic capitulation for Ukraine, and that it would give Russia breathing space to prepare for another hot war and possible further territorial acquisitions a few years down the road. Well, it could be argued the contrary. Such a deal need not be a capitulation for Ukraine, but rather a Lenin-like one step backward before eventual 2 steps forward. What should never be forgotten is that Ukraine has been victorious during this current great Southern War. Not only has the country survived, it has become a civic nation state whose citizens, regardless of their ethno-linguistic or religious heritage, ethnic Ukrainian, Russian-speaking Ukrainian, Polish, Jewish, Crimean Tatar, among others, all have been Ukrainianized and patriotized to a degree that they had never been before. And as important is the growth of Ukraine's battle-tested military force that is one of the best and certainly most experienced of any in the world today. With these 2 victories, survival as a state and real military strength, Ukraine is ready for a truce that would give them breathing space. To do what? Expand its armed forces? Extend further an already existing domestic arms industry? And rebuild or recreate a nuclear arsenal? Why should any existing nuclear power block Ukraine from doing this? Ukraine is a sovereign state whose leaders have only one responsibility: to act in their country's self-interest. Among the elements of its self-interest is to become, again, a power with nuclear military capacity. Now, agreeing to a truce, such as I theoretically outlined or some variant thereof, does not mean that Ukraine is giving up anything, including its territory. Some parts of the east, south, and Crimea may remain temporarily under Russian occupation. But after the truce and subsequent breathing space, there will come another day. In the interim, there is yet another victory that Ukraine has achieved, whether by itself or by circumstances. This is a victory that should never be underestimated. Before the Great Southern War began in 2014, Ukraine was a relatively unknown place in the greater scheme of things. Most people worldwide, if they ever even heard of Ukraine, would think that it was somewhere in Russia and that Ukrainians were some kind of Russians. That is no longer the case. Even more significant is that Ukrainians themselves have fervently made the case that they are Europeans and that Ukraine is Europe. Ukraine is Europe. Such a radical stance was hardly acceptable to most Europeans before 2014. For instance, we know how back in 1991, American political leaders bemoaned the possible collapse of the Soviet Union, how terrible that would be. And also how until recently, France and Germany seemed incapable of overcoming their ingrained Russophile attitudes, whether for practical economic reasons, as in the case of Germany, or more nebulous cultural reasons in the case of France. Thanks to the policy of Russia's present regime, rational or emotional Russophilism has basically disappeared among most Europeans. In turn, a new generation of Europeans has recognized the reality that Ukraine is a part of Europe. Consequently, Europe's leaders, some minor exceptions, know that Ukraine, as a fellow European country, must be defended. Now, as for Ukraine's membership in the European Union, we should actually not forget Cyprus, of all places. Technically, a state of war existed between Greece and Turkey when, in 2004, the southern, quote-unquote, Greek half of the island was accepted into the European Union. And so Cyprus provides a workable precedent for Ukraine. By the way, not half of Ukraine, only 20% of Ukraine. is occupied by Russia. So it's a workable precedent to become part of the European Union. In any case, it is Europe that counts. Well-wishers, potential supporters, whether they be governments or individuals or corporations or whatever, worldwide, should provide financial, military, and moral support to the entity to which Ukraine already belongs, Europe and the European Union. Ukraine exists. Ukraine has a future. And there will even be times when the future will be bright. But as that future unfolds, Ukrainians and the Europe of which it is a part must never forget two realities. Ukraine will remain in a permanent state of war, and Ukrainians must put trust only in themselves and certainly in not any great power. So much for my opening statement.
Thank you very much, Professor, for this very interesting talk. And I'm going to begin by making the shortest of comments, and then I'll ask a question, and then I'll
maybe ask another question.
Yes.
Depending on my response.
It's funny that you should begin this talk by talking about the Great Northern War. Mm-hmm. Because for me and for Antoinetta and for us in this department, the Great Northern War is of paramount importance. It's actually one of the initial points of Slavic studies in this country. We have a wealth of materials in our archives, lots and lots, pertaining not only to Russia, but certainly to Ukraine. And very important and new discoveries are being made all the time. Just to take a simple example, my colleague here, Antoinetta, going through one of the uncatalogued collections here at the University Library, just happened to come across Charles XII's tactical journal from the Ukrainian campaign, written in Veliki Budishcha, just north of Poltava. And there is another incomplete copy at Skokloster, a famous book collection. But this one that Antoinetta found has illustrations, beautiful illustrations. So please spread the word when you go back to Canada and to the United States, that there is a lot of Slavic material lying about, you know, in our archives and libraries, just waiting to be discovered and researched. That's my comment. My question is this: you said that this full-scale invasion has brought Ukrainian citizens of all ethnic backgrounds together. And made them, and somehow consolidated the Ukrainian state. And do you think that this will stay this way after a possible truce or peace agreement, or will it break up along the old fault lines?
First, just a kind of a comment on your comment regarding your appreciation of my mentioning the Great Northern War, and as you pointed out, that this, in a sense, the Great Northern War was the stimulus for kind of Slavic studies in Sweden. Most people don't know this. The United States, certainly by the second half of the 20th century, invested actually millions of dollars in fellowships, scholarships, support for research on their major enemy, post-Sputnik Soviet Union. And suddenly, study of the Soviet Union, Russian language, primarily, little spill-off about the Soviet satellite countries in Central Europe. But does anyone know how Slavic studies began in America, which then became one of the leading centers for the study of the Slavic Russian world? Well, the first course on quote-unquote Russian history was taught at Harvard University, I believe in 1897, and to make it palatable to a WASP American context, the name of the course was The Great Northern War. This is how they sold Russian historical knowledge to North America, by calling it the Great Northern War. So now back to my supposition that as a result of the war brought Ukrainians together. Well, I don't know if we brought Ukrainians together. Ukrainians were always together, but their awareness of what it meant to be Ukrainian may have differed. Up until the war, the presumption was not only in large sectors of the Ukrainian population, despite the constitutional statement of 1996, was that to be a Ukrainian really meant to be an ethnic Ukrainian, in the sense that you had to speak Ukrainian, you had to have ethnic Ukrainian forebears. I mean, that was what a Ukrainian was. And by the way, that's the perception in most parts of the world, and even until today. Well, what was going, and that was, in a sense, a normal reality that applied to most stateless peoples, that is, peoples before they had states, right? But since 1991, in its most current form, Ukraine is a state. And it's not only in this, with a specific territory, that was not only comprised of ethnic Ukrainians. Ethnic Ukrainians may have been the majority population, but it's not only ethnic Ukrainians, peoples of various ethnic origins. Now, in reality, with the exception of quote-unquote Russians, whether actually ethnic Russians or Russophone Ukrainians, with the exception of that, people of other backgrounds, Jews, Crimean Tatars, Bulgarians, Moldavians, and Romanians, they were born, raised, lived most of their lives, and all of their forebears on the territory of Ukraine, but for various reasons, Ukraine was a nominal identity. They almost always used Russian, other than their native languages. So, you know, they had this kind of passive relationship to the territory in which they lived. Russophone Ukrainians even had a more tricky situation because, yes, they may have had Ukrainian forebears, but they felt more comfortable functioning in the Russian language. It was part of their world. And these were the kind of quote-unquote, maybe what the West, not understanding Ukraine, kind of talk about the term you just used, fault lines. Okay,
there's a big division between Western Ukraine and Eastern Ukraine. In Western Ukraine, there are real ethnic Ukrainians, but in Eastern Ukraine, they are mostly Russian speakers. And then that kind of fault line started to move, because then certainly Kiev and a lot of central Ukraine. Yeah. So, but this was artificial all along. That was just a simplistic manner in which Western commentators were trying to understand this society and then present it to the outside world. But after 2014 began a new thing. That is, that for the population of Ukraine, regardless of their ethno-linguistic background or regardless of their commitment to their ethnic linguistic background, because that's another question, began to feel that their country was being invaded. Their country. What was it? The first person who died on the Maidan was of Armenian background in Ukraine, as an example. And then that process, which began in 2014, just accelerated after 2022. We know that the vast majority of soldiers fighting in the Ukrainian army in the east are Russian speakers, but they're local Ukrainians, right? Willing to die for their country. And so you ask, the question is, okay, you have this outside threat. The outside threat helps to bring cohesion to a society. Well, after the outside threat is not there anymore, there'll be a truce. Will this cohesion break down? Well, actually, the cohesion was already there. It just wasn't expressed and consciously embedded in the population. Now it's consciously embedded in the population. And there's another thing. The idea of division within society based on categories, which of course the Soviet Union implemented, and the Russian Empire implemented, and the Austro-Hungarian implemented, that you were formally identified by your either nationality. Actually, as you well know, we all say nationality. These statistics were not on your national identity, it was on your linguistic identity. This was the case in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and it was the case in the Russian Empire as well. Okay, but then we read language equals national identity. Oh, be that as it may, which in many cases it did. That phenomenon already started to break itself down under Soviet times. The present generation of Ukrainians, like this charming lady right in front of me, they don't think in these terms. Those are old-fashioned concepts. They're from Ukraine. Who cares who their grandparents was or their great-grandparents, whatever? They're Ukrainians. And so that is what has now, so therefore, in answer to your question, no, I don't see the so-called old fault lines returning.
Thank you very much. And I can see now that we have sociologists and historians and political scientists wildly chomping at their bits. So I'm going to allow Professor Hyde-Price the first question, please.
Thank you. Professor Adrian Hyde-Price from the Department of Political Science. Thank you very much for your talk. I actually still want to push you. I'm a political scientist. And I mean, I think that the concern about what happens after some sort of ceasefire or truce is not so much that the old fault lines within Ukraine will re-emerge. I think war has been a transformative experience in that regard, but it's more that the political system in Ukraine is still relatively underdeveloped. There's a role for oligarchs, and there's a concern about the process of, what in all democracies is that process of interest, articulation and integration. How do you build stable political... So, it's a political science question. I mean, from that perspective, I mean, I do wonder whether the cohesion in Ukrainian society will survive the end of the war, and what new political fault lines might emerge. And can I just make one comment? Towards the end of the paper, you mentioned Cyprus. I mean, there's a new book by the former Swedish foreign minister Tobias Billström. And towards the end of that, he points explicitly to the case of Cyprus to say Cyprus was a disaster for the European Union. It was not a success story. It's imported all sorts of problems within the European Union. Cyprus was only included because basically Greece threatened to stop the whole.
The issue.
So, I mean, I agree with the rest of the paragraph. I think there's a need for Europeans to embrace Ukraine, do what they can to help rebuild the society and bring it into the European Union. But I would be a little bit careful about, drawing on Cyprus as a precedent and a good working case, because, you mentioned Cyprus and Ukraine in the same breath, and, the reaction, I think, will not be quite what you hoped for.
Good.
I just had final, if I can just add. I mean, I would be interested to know something about the Jewish community in Ukraine, if you have a few moments to say something about that. How large is it? Whereabouts geographically is it situated? Sorry.
Let me just touch on the Cyprus thing first. Thank you very much for alerting me to not push that one. But the only reason I used it, is that, as you well know, the European Union traditionally has always sought excuses to keep people out of the club. In the 1990s, after the collapse of communist rule in the former Soviet satellite countries, no one wanted, what? Former communist countries into the European Union? You got to be kidding. If Cyprus was a disaster, well, Bulgaria and Romania are not far behind. But, they're there. The only reason I mentioned the Cyprus case is that the European Union will always try to find some kind of excuse. Well, excuse me, you did it. You see what I'm saying? Whether it was great decision or not a great decision, it is a precedent. Maybe the wrong precedent, but you can't say that there was no precedent. So that's why I use it. But I will keep in mind how to kind of finesse that thing. If you will, the general question of the politics after the war. Again, here we are. Now we're in the political science world. We're speculating. What do we really know? Either you or I. By the way, I am nominally part of a Department of Political Science as well as History at the University of Toronto. But what do we really know? That's what we're paid for. And so we keep jobs and we write books about speculation. So, we know that much of what Ukraine's success has been, certainly since the second phase of the war, does revolve around one individual, a very charismatic individual. The idea of, the role of the individual in history, which of course a lot of people wanted to forget, well, it still plays itself out. I mean, where would we be right now, or where would Ukraine be right now without this Volodymyr Zelensky? Who, by the way, one would never thought on the basis of his record before 2021 would turn out to be what he turned out to be. It's pretty remarkable. Well, what is that could potentially lead to? You remember how in the early phase of the war, this is the new Churchill. I'm worried about? If we were looking into the future. What happened after the end of World War II? The great leader of the Western world was voted out of office. And that was it. He left within a few months. Is Ukraine ready? And is that society ready? And is a personality like Zelensky, who has formed that society, after there are no longer any war conditions in which you have free elections, would he as a person be able to see the bigger picture and step down voluntarily? And then become, by the way, immortalized forever? Or would he try to stay in power by one way or another? That's really, in one sense, a concern. On the other hand, aside from Ukrainian society and its citizenry becoming aware of their belonging to a state with a civic identity, and that they are Ukrainian because they belong to the state, there's another thing in play. Ukrainians, actually ever since the Orange Revolution, way back in 2004, as a societal polity, became aware, which is a massive change in social political psychology, coming from an imperial Russian society and a Soviet society, that the people could make change, that they could go out into the street and protest, and they would have an impact. I mean, this is like, stop and think about it. Crazy. Well, they did it in 2004. They did it late into, and now, do you think you're going to tell Ukrainians or any political force, whether it's an individual or a group of oligarchs, you think you're going to be able to take over the country and force a certain kind of rule down these people's throats, who, by the way, are armed with an army? So, we don't know how it's going to play out. Of course we don't know how it's going to play out. But I don't have that kind of worry that you put forth as you should as a skeptical colleague in political science. Now, last question was the Jewish community. The Jewish community, first of all, the numbers have declined drastically. We have, as you know, no clue of even the population of Ukraine anymore, just simple figures. But we do know that already since the last census, or the only census taken under independent Ukraine in 2001, that the number of Jews has since then been declining. So their numbers are smaller. Many of the organizations, self-help organizations that were created after 1991, funded in large measure by Jewish secular and religious organizations, primarily from North America, primarily from the United States, that many of them aren't functioning as they had been before, simply because either the funds have dried up from the sources, or the number of people who are attending Jewish programs or welfare schools or whatever, there are not that many Jews anymore. On the other hand, one also would wish to say that Jews are among those various peoples of Ukraine who have adopted a civic identity, that you don't hear Jews from Ukraine calling themselves Russian Jews anymore, and even those in the diaspora, well, there are diehards, we know, because the diaspora is always made up of people of ancient mindset. But many in the diaspora also speak now of their forebears from Ukraine, not their forebears from Russia, but that's the diaspora. That's always a different story. But in Ukraine itself, the major Jewish communities and organizations all are in the forefront of being Ukrainian Jews and in support, full-fledged support of the war effort in defense of their country, Ukraine. Symbolic of this is a man named Joseph Zissels, who had spoken out very actively on the Maidan, etc., etc. So that would be my comment on the question of Jews.
Thank you very much. Next question, Professor Andrén.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your talk. I enjoyed listening to it, and I think it illuminated many issues for me. I'm doing history of ideas, so my question to
I'm sorry, sir. Can you just speak now a little bit louder?
Okay.
I've got, good.
Yeah, good.
Keep it that way.
I keep it that way.
Thank you.
I'm doing history of ideas.
Yes?
So my question regards ideas. I have been fascinated, struck by how it seems like the Ukrainian identity has grown stronger together with self-conceptions as a European country.
Mm-hmm.
And that goes quite in line with what we have seen long ago in Central Europe and also part of Western Europe. But I would like you to ask, I want to ask you if you can say something on this self-understanding as a European nation during this long history of being a nation without a state.
Mm-hmm.
Was it, for instance, during the harsh period of the interwar years? Was there a conception of Ukraine being a European country in contrast to Russia in that period? Did you have that conception also in this short-lived period of attempts to raise Ukrainian state by the end of the First World War, or previously, or is this conception of being Europeans, is that so to say more modern?
Mm-hmm. Very useful question to reflect upon. I would say that the idea, the inclination of Ukrainian society toward the rest of Europe is not something new. And as you well know, when we're speaking about Ukrainian society, we're usually speaking about the articulate social strata of the society, not the society as a whole, because what do we know about the society as a whole? So, educated people in Ukraine had always, traditionally, been drawn in two directions. Either toward Poland or toward Muscovy. And the natural inclination was to be drawn toward Polish culture. After all, they were part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. They were educated in the same Latin language schools, Bogdan Khmelnytsky, for example. the great Cossack leader was educated in a Latin language gymnasium in Yaroslav, one thinks. Latin, in any case, was the language used in the Kiev Academy for many years, certainly pushed by Petro Mohila. And as a result, people from Ukraine, of those social strata, functioned within a larger European world and traveled to Italy because Poland was very close, and took models of architecture, literary models from Italy in the 16th and still in the 17th century. So this was already embedded in Ukrainian society. But Ukrainian society has always been divided. Now here's the divide. This is not the fault lines of journalists. The divide is a religious one. What we always tend to forget, certainly in our 20th century secular world, is we forget the role of religion, or we downplay it. Well, it's extremely important in many traditional societies of the world. We don't have to talk about the Muslim world, by the way, right? But certainly in Central and in Eastern Europe. And there is a world of a difference between the Orthodox world and the Roman world. Slavica Orthodoxa, Slavia Romana. And Ukraine is in the middle of this. And their intellectuals were drawn in both directions. And since they were, by cultural tradition, Eastern Christian, they had to figure out a way to adapt that if they had leanings toward the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in the west of Europe. And then we come up with this in-between religion, the Greek Catholic Church, and so forth and so on. But there was a constant problem. So, and then also drawn toward Muscovy were these Orthodox prelates, almost all from the Kiev Mohila Academy, who by the 17th century created, as you people probably know better than I, in Russian cultural history, the Ukrainian era, right? That's where they got all their secular knowledge from these guys who were trained in a Polish environment in Kiev, and they brought that knowledge to the north. And of course, Muscovy and the Russian government pushed that to make it as attractive as possible for members of the elite of Ukrainian society, first religious and then secular, to function within the Muscovite Russian world. Right? So there was drawn in these both directions. But to go back to your question, the European direction was one of two existing directions, if you will, which came to be emphasized at the second half of the 20th century. Why? Well, they had enough of experience with the Russian Empire, and in particular the Soviet Empire. Well, Soviet Union, well, we don't want to be part of that anymore, right? However, it is also true, I remember very well, still in the 1990s, if you travel to Donetsk or in the eastern part of Ukraine, persons on the street, they don't want to hear about NATO, they want to hear about Europe, it's bad, and so forth. You know, those kind of stereotypes were still embedded in their mind. That was true. But that was the 90s. That was before 2004. That was before 2013. Now we're in a new ballgame. So it's not, I guess the long and short of it, it's not something new It's been around for a long time. It's just as that European orientation is now more pronounced and more evident for obvious reasons.
Thank you. Next question is Professor Shmulyar Green.
Yes. Thank you so much, Professor Maґочій. My name is Oksana Shmulyar-Green, and I'm by the name Ukrainian. I lived in Sweden for over 30 years, and to tell you with great pain, I really agree with two of your principles that you have formulated. It doesn't mean that I like them, and it doesn't mean that I accept them. But I really find a very painful truth in these two principles, because at some point in the middle of the 90s, when I went for a seminar in Stockholm, actually based on the analysis of history of Ukrainian developments in Ukraine, one of the Swedish professors just stated, Ukraine is in between East and West. It's destiny.
So, I'm sorry, Ukraine is in between?
Between East and West.
Yeah, okay.
So it's destiny. You have to accept it, and there is nothing to be done. So we see the same truths to be formulated even today. However, in relation to these principles, I was wondering, is there a possibility that we can imagine a scenario that if Ukrainians cannot trust big powers, and if Ukraine is to remain in the state of war, can we imagine ourselves that there is something that Europe or any other actor can do so that big powers can influence the developments in Russia to stop the war?
Mm-hmm.
It's one of the questions.
Okay.
The second
Moment, I just want to jot that down. Yep.
The second one is actually more of a reflection, because as sociologist, I study migration in general terms.
I studied
Migration.
Migration, yeah?
Yeah, at the moment I'm a part of a bigger project where we study how Ukrainians are received in different European countries.
In European countries today.
Exactly, yeah. And there is another kind of upcoming disappointment, because what we see is a changing attitude. We can see it in Germany, we can see it in Poland, we don't see it in Sweden, it's not politicized yet, but we can see it in many countries that received Ukrainians, that people on the ground, public opinion, are starting to be more negative. And just to wonder what can it bring in terms of political stability, attitudes in the future, and how it can influence the outcomes when it comes to, pushing people to return, integrating them, and etc. What would be your opinion? Thank you.
So if we're in a scenario of permanent war, if one accepts my premise, then what can Ukraine do in terms of its relations with great powers? And then, in turn, somehow can these great powers influence Russia? So, first, the only reality for Ukraine is being part of Europe, and Europe has to become a great power. But that's a European issue. Right? That's your issue. You're part of it. You guys, Europe has to get its act together for itself, not only for Ukraine. And then, Ukraine being part of Europe, because it is anyway, regardless whether it's formally in European Union or NATO, Europeans have become committed to Ukraine, great revolution. Can somehow some great powers have influence over Russia to stop this conflict or ameliorate this conflict? Forget it. Sorry, Russia or any society is created after centuries and centuries of historical and intellectual experience, which is embedded in their
cultural genes, right? I know some people are going to react to this, right? But it is, it's inside. And the Russian mentality, like the American mentality, like the Chinese mentality, these are imperialists. They all think that the world belongs to them. And this doesn't make a difference whether you're an American or a Russian or a Chinese. That's the way it is. And why? Well, in the case of China, China's been around for a long time, right? So, okay. Russia's also been, Muscovy, Russia's been around for a while. But that's it. You're never going to change this. And to think that you can, to think that somehow, oh, you know, you have these protests on the street of Moscow or St. Petersburg, and oh, look at, you got to be kidding. The vast majority of people, as you well know, within Russia today, and the mothers living in villages in the middle of nowhere, I'm so happy that my son has died on behalf of our country, Russia, fighting those Nazis in Ukraine. This is not Putin's war. He's just an instrument for Russian society that has been around for centuries. So the idea that somehow Russia is going to be influenced in a pipe dream. You're going to influence American public to give up Arizona and New Mexico and most of California back to Mexico to where it belongs culturally? Right? I mean, it's your study with regard to migration, European problem. But not only a European problem, after all, I come from Canada, United States, Australia. Having just said one thing, I'm going to nix what I just said. As I would always say to students, don't compare apples to oranges. Immigrant societies like Canada, the United States, and Australia are not the same as European societies or other societies in which you have populations embedded there forever. So forget what I just said. I just had a Freudian slip. Let's go back just to European societies. You know, this is somewhat natural that Europe welcomed Ukrainians with open arms after 2022 was a phenomenally wonderful thing. Sooner or later, you're going to get tired. I mean, this is also normal. The educational level of citizens of Ukraine, very high. One of the reasons why they're successful in building a society and carrying on this campaign against Russia, highly talented people. And many of them who have actually been forced to come to Europe, many of them given a choice would want to go home. By the way, you know, what's so great about Europe? What's so great about, you know, working as a cleaning woman in Lisbon in Portugal when, you know, you were a teacher or you were a doctor somewhere in Ukraine? Okay, you got to do it for a while because of circumstances beyond one's control, but it seems to me, you're the sociologist, you're studying this, maybe you have some data, at least on those in Sweden. I mean, what percentage of Ukrainians want to go home when it's possible to go home? And so I'm going to ask you the question, whether you're, in your research, have you encountered Ukrainian refugees in Sweden who wish to return when and if they can? And if you have, what percentage of the group would you think they are?
I'm not the only Ukrainian in the room. So
Yes, but you're the sociologist
Yes,
doing
yes,
this
yes,
project.
yes, but I just
We don't
want to-
care whether you're Ukrainian or not. This is a
Yeah.
question of your profession.
The thing is that it's important sometimes to justify or to check how another person with my background would answer on this question. But to tell you from what I know from the field is that when the war, full-scale invasion 2022 started, approximately 80% in general who left Ukraine wanted to go back.
Mhm.
But 4 years after, these
You get used to
answers
being-
are not positive anymore. And it's not because of the fact that people don't want to go back, but people right now calculate and compare the options. Because what we usually in research forget very often is that Ukrainians are also very transnational nation.
Are very
Transnational.
transnational, yeah?
They've been going away to work and to earn money and to live in Poland, in the UK, in Canada.
In the late 19th century to the United
Exactly.
States, you know, we, of course.
There is a big diaspora.
Right.
all around.
Or to Far Eastern Russia, yeah, of
Yeah.
course, right.
So there is
Emigration is a normal phenomenon.
Exactly. So there is some projection that Ukrainians who actually went away in 2022 would prefer to have this transnational life, meaning that part of the family is somewhere settled, children have education, stability, and maybe parents go back home, which of course is a tragedy for Ukraine, because I live this tragedy right now. My older parents are in Ukraine,
Right.
and I'm here in Sweden, you know. So this is the situation. So there are no percentages of how many people want to go, because it's only about intentions. The factual thing is that out of 8 to 10 millions who left, approximately 4 millions did came back.
Ah, pardon, and this is not just to Sweden, all over Europe.
Yes.
Repeat that fascinating statistic. Out of 8 to 10 million who left, 4 million have gone back.
Yeah.
Remarkable. While the war's still going on, remarkable.
And actually they keep visiting Ukraine as my son
Yeah.
every year. That's all.
Може бути, хтось хоче задати питання українською мовою? Or first, sir, please.
Okay, my background is Hungarian.
Teşekkür parançol.
Your name sounds like Hungarian too. Anyway, my academic background is sociology and social anthropology, but I've been retired for 18 years, so I'm not updated. One of my interests has been and is ethnic relations and cultural diversity. And what I was wondering about, you said that Ukraine is and has been multicultural, and there are different ethnic groups, but you didn't say anything about the different ethnic groups, and you didn't mention the Hungarian group. And I know that Orban, the Hungarian Prime Minister, he is not very keen to accept Ukraine. As you know, he's more than with Putin. And one of his reasons, or one of his arguments, is that the Ukrainians have been and still are discriminating the Hungarian minority. What do you say about that? And the other groups, the other minorities, how many different minorities are there, and how are their relationships with the Ukrainians? We have mentioned that you talked about the relationship between the Ukrainians and the Russians, but not between the other groups. Can you say something about that, please?
Yeah, I thought I may have alluded to the status in terms of speaking about Russian language use among Romanians, Bulgarians, Crimean Tatars, etc. But nonetheless, they have all of those groups or people of those backgrounds, and also Polish people of Polish background or ancestry, or Jewish ancestry, have bought into the Ukrainian civic identity that has been building ever since 2014, and certainly reaching greater
intensity after 2022. They feel totally comfortable within Ukrainian society. They are first and foremost Ukrainian, and especially, and their numbers are very small. If you look, perhaps, I don't know in which book, that book, The Big History. Again, this is, with the exception of Russians, that's a different situation, it's a different thing. Their numbers are relatively small in terms of the Ukrainian population as a whole, and do not put great emphasis, of the vast majority of them, on their ethnic origins. One small example, the preservation of a Polish national identity among the remnants of ethnic Poles, most of whom were expelled or deported to Poland as an exchange population after World War II. There were some remnants left. The traditional stronghold for preserving Polish language was in the Roman Catholic Church. And there are still Roman Catholic parishes, and pretty big ones, a place like Zhytomyr, primarily in the eastern part, what used to be called Eastern Galicia. All of the Roman Catholic masses and liturgies and masses are in Ukrainian, not in Polish. So the kind of emphasis on one's ethnic origins, ancestral origins, is in practice less and less. This does not apply to Jews because there it's a religious phenomenon. If a person of Jewish background decides to want to become a Jew again or for the first time, right? And not all of them do. But that's a religious, that's clearly religious. Now we go to the Magyars. Magyars are specific, somewhat of a specific case. First of all, there was what? Used to be 150,000, maybe not 150,000 anymore, but they also live in a compact territory right on the border of Hungary. This is not the case of Poles or Jews or even Romanians and Bulgarians don't live near Romania or Bulgaria. Maybe the Moldovans close to Moldova. But in general, so the Hungarian case is a special case. Most Hungarians, let's say Magyars to be more precise, are living in the southern part of Transcarpathia, are totally satisfied with their lives. And, little fact here, until Orban came to power, Hungary, even after the integration of these countries into the European Union, had what? At least a third, if not a half, of Magyars living outside the borders of Hungary, whether in southern Slovakia, whether in the Burgenland in Austria, whether in northern Vojvodina, and certainly in Transylvania, and then in Transcarpathia. Of all of those countries, the best status of Magyars was where? In Ukraine. Totally. Orban comes to power. This is a pure and simple political issue. This is a leader who needs to stay in power, which is the most important thing for any political leader, and they will do whatever is necessary to stay in power. He's got the threat of the right wing. He has to try to, shore up his support, and so he plays the ethnic card on the one group of Magyars who had no problems, unlike in Transylvania or in southern Slovakia. And that's what this is all about. And pure and simple. And there was Hungary before Orban, and there will be Hungary after Orban.
Let's go.
Yes, we have a question here, please.
Well, some more factual questions, perhaps. I hear that before the latest developments, the 22, the largest group of Ukrainians outside of Ukraine and Russia was in Canada.
Mm-hmm.
Is that true?
That is absolutely true, and it's, I think, still the case that, well, I don't know where these 10 million are in Europe, but because these are refugees. The answer is that is true.
Yeah.
Yep. 1.1 million or 1.2 million now in Canada, or 1.1 or 1.2 Canadians claimed their heritage is Ukrainian in the last census.
The sort of idea of Ukraine, the feeling for Ukraine, the feeling of Ukrainian identity in most of these people is apparently now there is developing literature that is studied at the universities of Ukrainian Canadians. I wonder if you could say something more about that.
Yes, by the way, until a couple months ago, when I finally formally retired, I am now Professor Emeritus. After 45 years, I was the first and only holder of the endowed chair of Ukrainian Studies at the University of Toronto, which was created in part by the Ukrainian Canadian community in cooperation with the federal government. So with regard to the diaspora, and in this case the Ukrainian diaspora specifically in Canada, which is very much different from the history of Ukrainian Canadians or Americans of Ukrainian background in the United States. Canada, and this particular issue, totally different. As an example, when I was a student in the 1960s, undergraduate student, like Professor Rosen just mentioned to me earlier, that Ukrainian wasn't taught here in Sweden, and he's like one of the first to do this. Ukrainian was taught nowhere in the United States, nowhere, until actually Harvard created in the early 70s the Harvard program. In Canada, on the other hand, going back to the 1920s, they had colleges, university courses in Ukrainian language, in Ukrainian literature. Canadian society as a whole was aware of the existence of Ukrainians. If you were in the United States, no one knew, never even heard of Ukrainian. You said you're Ukrainian, oh, you're Russian. Completely normal. Canada, entirely different. And very specifically developed since the first immigration started before World War I, but primarily the bigger one was the interwar period, and then the post-World War II period, immediately post-World War II period. And during this long period of time, you had actually you not only had and needed to study Ukrainian language and culture and history as it played itself out in the homeland, but also in North America. So yes, there is a Canadian-Ukrainian literature in Ukrainian and in English. We had I remember at the 30th anniversary of the Chair of Ukrainian Studies, we had a full-day conference just on female authors in Canada of Ukrainian background, writing on Ukrainian themes at the university. So this is Ukrainian studies, Ukrainian Canadian studies is a developed phenomenon. They created an institute. The Harvard Institute was created in 1970. The Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies was created in University of Alberta in 1974 with the specific purpose of studying Ukrainian Canadians. So, well-developed tradition, which is a reflection of the presence and influence of ethnic Ukrainians and their descendants, despite generations, in Canada. And I mentioned, this is important to remember, 1,100,000, 1,100,000, 1,200,000. That means, because Canada, you know, is a small country. It's one of the smallest countries in the world. I mean, smaller than Poland. It had only 35 million people. Now maybe it's got 40 million. It's a small country. Well, if there are 1 million Ukrainians, that's a pretty high percentage. Or 1 million plus. At one point, they made 10% of the population of Canada. So, well-known phenomenon with well-developed intellectual infrastructure.
Yes, ladies and gentlemen, we are about to wrap this up, but I have one more question, if I may. You are not only the professor, now emeritus of Ukrainian studies at the University of Toronto, but you are also the president of the Russian World Congress, if I'm correctly informed. Yes.
That's a question?
Yeah, no, it's not. I'm saying this, telling the audience.
Oh, I'm
Are you emeritus?
I am the honorary chairman of the World Congress of Russians. Yes.
Yes. And when I was doing my PhD, my supervisor was Professor Sven Gustafsson at Uppsala. And he had this special thing for the Russians. And my question is this. The Russian ethnic group does not only live in Ukraine, but in several other countries in the region. What would you say, has this ethnic group been impacted by the war, by the full-scale war in any particular way? I feel that if I didn't ask this question, Professor Gustafsson would never forgive me.
Right.
Right.
And as we know, Professor Gustafsson and I were very close colleagues and friends. And first of all, let's get terminology here. We're not talking about Russians, even though everyone talks about Russians. We're talking about Carpatho-Russians, which is different from Russians. Russians is a very vague term, as probably many of you East Slavists know. As a title of one of my books in Ukrainian, which I'll translate into English, is every Carpatho-Russin is a Russin, but not every Russin is a Carpatho-Russin. So, and you're absolutely correct, Carpatho-Russins, as the indigenous population of the territories in which they live. It's not only in Ukraine, it's also in northeastern Slovakia and in southeastern Poland, the so-called Yaremkos. But the specific question of the impact of the war,
of the full-scale
war on the Carpatho-Russian community.
Yeah, I was interested in whether they cooperate more closely than other groups in society, or if there is a lot of cross-border assistance and things like that.
One characteristic of Carpatho-Russian society and Carpatho-Russian mentality is that they have always been loyal to the state in which they live. Period. Doesn't make a difference whether it was the Hungarian Kingdom, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, or Czechoslovakia, or Soviet Ukraine, or Soviet Union, and now Ukraine. They serve in the army. I mean, they're citizens of Ukraine. They're drafted into the army. There are units specifically from Transcarpathia that have been noted for their bravery on the front. I can tell you, because of just physically seeing in cemeteries, including not only in Uzhhorod and Mukachevo, you know, hundreds of new graves. So the Carpatho-Russians who live in Ukraine are just like any other Ukrainians regardless of their background. Now, of course, Carpatho-Russians, like Magyars, analogously, live on both sides of these borders. And until the war, even though it was quote-unquote a European Union border where they had to strengthen it, still, you know, the idea of going back and forth, very easy. And by the way, it is still very easy, as long as you're a woman or a child. But if you are between the ages of whatever it is now, 24 and 60, or it changes, so none of the males can leave. And that does have, by the way, an impact on the evolution of Carpatho-Russian culture. Why? Because the biggest center for Carpatho-Russian culture is in Slovakia, in the city of Prešov, where there's an Institute of Russian Language and Culture, where they have at least 2 professors from Uzhhorod who can only travel there with great difficulty. No young people can come. That university operates an international summer school. There are always people, participants from Ukraine, usually from Transcarpathia, only females. So the impact of that is the impact of the war. It has put a cramp in the developments and ties between Carpatho-Russians in Ukraine and Carpatho-Russians in Slovakia and Poland, as a for instance, which would be somewhat analogous to putting a cramp in the style of ethnic Magyars who live in the southern part of Transcarpathia, and certainly those of a certain age can't go to Hungary anymore.
Well, thank you very much, and